Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining our webinar today. My name is Pauline Thornton and I'm the Director of the Intelligence Systems and Engagement team at the Office of the Federal Safety Commissioner. I will be your host for today's webinar. You might have come across myself or my team previously when submitting incident reports and scheme biannual reports. We also handle webinars and communications products. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land. Here in Canberra, that is the Ngunnawal people, and I also acknowledge any other people or families with connections to the land of the ACT or the region. I extend this respect to the traditional custodians of the lands where you are joining us from online today. And we also acknowledge and respect their continuing culture and the contribution it makes. I would also like to welcome and acknowledge all First Nations people who are online for today's event. A couple of quick housekeeping things. Firstly, today's session will be recorded and published on our website in the coming weeks. We also have a Q&A session following today's presentation, and I encourage you to put any questions you might have in the chat Q&A box. Today's webinar focuses on one of the Federal Safety Commissioner's audit criteria, WH14, which is health surveillance and exposure monitoring and its sub-criteria. And WH14 has been something of a hot topic in recent years, particularly with respect to silicosis, asbestos and diesel particulate matters. WH14 is also an area in the OFSC where we see high rates of non-compliance, with corrective action report issue rates generally sitting around the 50% mark, and many of the sub-criteria falling within the top 20 worst performing sub-criteria as well. We're fortunate today to have Brett joining us. Brett Jones is a Federal Safety Officer who conducts audits for the Federal Safety Commissioner's Work Health and Safety Accreditation Scheme. Brett has over 20 years experience in the work health and safety industry and has represented industry associations and professional bodies on expert panels and regulatory reviews. Brett has also served as the Queensland branch chair of the Australian Institute of Health and Safety and is an expert in the work health and safety WH14 audit criteria in particular. After his presentation, as I've mentioned, Brett has kindly agreed to offer even more of his expert knowledge and participate in a Q&A session. If you have any questions, please put them in the question box throughout the webinar and we'll aim to answer as many as possible. Over to you, Brett.
Thanks, Pauline. Thanks for the very kind words and the introduction. And I reiterate everything you said about the traditional owners and the aim of the scheme. As an introduction to this criteria and following on from what Pauline was saying, the WH14 criteria are a difficult criteria because of the sort of professional understanding of occupational hygiene and associated matters. While this criteria does extend to other bits and pieces, that's the primary focus, and I'll go through some parts of that today, and hopefully I can make that a little bit clearer. I'm presenting this as a Federal Safety Officer. I'm not an occupational hygienist. I have some experience, obviously, in the drafting of the criteria, and they are introductory level criteria that are trying to improve the overall understanding of occupational hygiene and working towards improvements in the health aspects of health and safety. So these criteria are the primary ones around that, in addition to existing criteria around WH12.3, which is our project-specific risk assessment, and other related criteria where we're managing health aspects of health and safety within the construction context. Just a reminder, as most, if not all of you on the call would get from your auditors and your other FSOs when they're auditing those criteria, and likewise when you're doing your own gap analyses and developing systems and doing all those things, it's just a return to the basic OFSC auditing principles around that all the criteria start with the words "there's a documented process for" or "the system ensures." So the OFSC is looking for you to have somewhere in your system that describes how you intend to comply with that particular criteria. Then how you execute the implementation of that particular way you've decided to manage the criteria against your documented process. And then the FSO will be looking for evidence that you did what you said you would do against that, obviously. Also remembering that the OFSC criteria are around the criteria as your primary compliance element, because that's what your accreditation is attached to. But obviously the FSO will also be looking at relevant regulatory requirements and what your system says that you will do. And often that's a large proportion of us not doing, or accredited companies not doing what their system says. I'll do my best to go through some basic level regulatory requirements also within this space, and respectfully understand that everyone will know most, if not all of those, but just as a reiteration within the context of the criteria. Also a reminder about the OFSC audit criteria guidelines, or the evidence guide, or other terms that it's used, which exist on the OFSC website, and I'll refer to that throughout the criteria that we'll go through. Okay. Just some basic principles around the 14 criteria. So probably the most common thing I see with respect to these criteria, and other FSOs likewise, is that we get confused between health monitoring and personal exposure monitoring. We could say the harmonised law was a causal factor in some of that, whereas people who have been in the game for a little while will remember or recall that health monitoring was called health surveillance. It was changed to health monitoring as a part of that review. But certainly the criteria do differentiate between those two definitions, and I'll go through that in a little bit more detail further on. We also often the referral to a hygienist, and that's a sort of a spectrum of capability, experience and training. So I'll go through that a little bit, the defined parameters around that. Also for 14.5, where we go through hazardous chemicals, so that connection between hazardous substances and dangerous goods. Some systems still have some older parts of their system that refer to those as separate elements. And then some acronyms around workplace exposure standards, similar exposure groups, which is a technical term that I'll go through. I'll refer to the AIOH as the professional body for hygienists at times when we're talking about training and qualifications and competency. And then also some basic principles around, particularly around health monitoring with the regulated requirements within Schedule 14 of harmonised law and Schedule 9 in Victoria. All right. Hopefully we don't get too bothered about too many introductory slides, but I'm just setting the context for the criteria. So we've sort of broken up the criteria, and as with a lot of OFSC criteria, we've sort of attempted to bundle a whole heap of things under a heading, and WH14 is no different. And the criteria sort of can be broken up into three separate components around the 14.1 to 14.3 are the management of health hazards. 14.4 is more around calibration and maintenance of measurement equipment related to health and safety measurements. And then 14.5, obviously, the management of hazardous chemicals. So that's just the separation, and I'll go through that in some detail, particularly 14.1 to 14.3, which really is an overview slide, and I'll get into the detail around this in the next slide. But certainly the primary overview of the way that we structure the 14.1 to 14.3 criteria around that life cycle of the green box 14.1 around the health hazard risk assessment, or the project risk assessment that identifies the relevant health hazards for the project and who does that and what our focus areas should be and are. 14.2 being around if we do decide that we need to take some personal exposure sampling, that this is what we need to do, these are the qualifications, and this is the expectations we would expect to see if we undertake that particular activity. And then obviously 14.3, the back end of the life cycle, where we're actually conducting some health monitoring or health surveillance by an occupational physician or medical practitioner, where we're testing potential exposures in a human. All right, just getting into a bit of detail, and hopefully everything's made sense so far. So on the screen is the audit criteria guidelines, and most of you will recognise those out of the evidence guidelines. And that's just the overview there. So the way that this is structured, for those of you who aren't familiar with the audit criteria guidelines, that The top part in red is the actual defined criteria that the auditor will have in front of them and that you will be expected to comply with. The scope is the real word terms about, well, this is what the criterion actually means in normal language as opposed to a criterion language. Possible evidence in that lightly shaded area, that's just a bit of a prompt for a hint for the types of things that may be the sorts of things you might present once you get to the evidence element. So I said, as I went through with the documented process, the implementation and the evidence element. The notes part of the audit criteria guidelines really are any things that will either be unsatisfactory or are a clarifier that we've had previously, whereby the criteria may have had some robust conversation about what complied and what didn't, but also some common elements that auditors are presented with that don't satisfy the criteria, and that's what that is there. And so as we go through each of these, and when you're reading the audit guidelines, hopefully that gives you some context for that. Now, going back to the criteria, we talk about that the documented process, you're a competent person who completes a site-specific assessment of potential health hazards, and then we've got some dot points around that. Now, for anyone who's on the call who is a technical hygienist, I do realise that biological, physical, chemical, atmospheric isn't technically how they are referred to as distinct terms in the occupational hygiene profession, but certainly that's just some guidance about what sort of things we'd like you to look at. And if we break the criteria up into the certain elements, the first part is what is a site-specific assessment. So what we're looking for there is a risk assessment by a defined competent person in the context of our project that we are undertaking with respect to health hazards. And this is usually in the form of a project risk assessment is the most common thing we observe, which is totally fine. For more complex projects, you might have a specific health hazard risk assessment by a more qualified and an experienced person that will go through what that health hazard risk assessment looks like. And I've got some examples of that coming up. So what we're looking for here is the company to think about what health hazards may arise from the equipment, the plant, the materials they use, the work environment that they're operating in, and the scope of work activities that they're undertaking. And we're looking for you to document these in a risk assessment format. Consistent with your risk methodology as per other OFSC criteria about consistency of interpretation of those. We're encouraging people to look at identifying controls, routine controls and other controls that are already in place, and then any additional site-specific controls we need to get the risk level to a tolerable risk level within the context of other OFSC criteria such as 12.5, where we're asking you to have a tolerable risk rating within your system. And as a part of that, we want you to consider how it will be within the context of potential chemical, physical, and biological health hazards as per the criterion. And some hazards may be common for all workers, such as outdoor work and heat stress. Others may be task specific, such as things as generating RCS during cutting activities or operating diesel-operated plant, conducting a welding exercise, or whatever it might be. Without getting too technical about potential health hazards that fit under those categories that we're looking for, this is just some ideas about what sort of health hazards are generated from routine activities that are conducted in the construction industry. So things like chemical and atmospheric hazards around paints and chemicals. Obviously, RCS is well known for everyone. Carbon monoxide from plant, diesel particulate matter from diesel engines, welding fumes. Then more physical hazards like our radiation, vibration and noise being one of the most common ones we identify. And then any relevant biological hazards that may be applicable to your project depending on what you're doing and the scope of work that you're executing, and perhaps some seasonal stuff in the current environment that we live in. The competent person element of the criteria. So as you see, like we've had a number of slides through just one criteria where we've got those certain components of it that we need to make sure we include now in system and we interpret appropriately, and also FSC being clear about what we're looking for. So we're certainly looking for a competent person. And this is up to the company to decide what competent is. And going back to the audit evidence guidelines, we talk about the glossary at the back end. I think it's like the last couple of pages within the audit evidence guide that talks about the common terms used, and competent is one of those. So we're looking for, usually we'll look for the company to define that, and that has ranged from all sorts of things as internal HIRAC training, people with Cert 4s or diplomas, all the way through that spectrum of competency through to certified hygienist being the highest level of hygienist, and everything in between. Because this is a risk-based activity and it's a risk assessment of health hazards rather than doing anything with respect to taking a sample, I'd encourage you to think about who might already have this knowledge in the context of operations and whether you may just need to seek outside help. But if someone in your organisation has some qualifications in this space and has a base level understanding of health hazards, then that would be the competency I'd go with whatever they hold. Obviously, in the context of the project scope, what the client's looking for, contractual stuff, and how readily available is internal and external expertise. But it's up to the company to define what they think that might be for that definition of competency. And here's some other examples of competent person. So, a Cert 4 or diploma will include basic elements of health hazard, tertiary qualifications. There are specific training that someone could do in occupational hygiene or a hygienist with reference to the institute. And possible outputs, as I said earlier, the most common thing we see is a project risk assessment stuff. This is a very basic level one that I've just thrown together for the purposes of the presentation around that. In a civil works operation, we might have some noise, dust, vibration, diesel fumes. That's the risk is excessive exposure to that particular thing within the context of your own risk measures, and then controls that you've already got in place, where we believe that we've got these things in place, they're already part of our system, we're managing that hazard from that particular thing. This is how we're making sure that these things are effective and working, and then we've got a residual risk level that is within our tolerable limits, that we don't believe we need to move to taking any specific sampling. And I'll go through 14.2, which starts to decide, well, when we do this assessment, when do we actually need to go and do anything additional to this? So this is what we're sort of looking to deliver by the competent person in the context of your risk element, the health hazards associated with the project works. There are more complex health risk assessments, and these are just a couple of examples here where on the left it's an example of down the left-hand side of that, the diagram on the left, where we've got actually all the potential health hazards on that particular thing, that particular project or site, and then across the top you've got what we call similar exposure groups, where those particular people doing those activities will have this particular risk level for against that particular health hazard. I said particular a lot of times there, but that's how it's all constructed around the potential hazard and the people who are doing the work, and what's the risk level of them being exposed above the exposure standard for that particular contaminant. On the right is a specific health risk assessment just related to respirable crystalline silica, and that's how it would be set up in that context of a larger project where we're trying to understand what sort of people would potentially have an exposure to that and where we might need to do further investigation. Obviously, going back to the slide here about as the base level, we're looking for a project risk register or risk assessment that includes health hazards done by a competent person to meet that criteria. But obviously, if you have a larger project, then you may consider getting a hygienist to do a more complex assessment. Hopefully that all makes sense so far. So 14.2 is the follow on that from our risk assessment, and our audit criteria guidelines start to talk about the same things as I went through before. So this one's still not about getting tested by an occupational physician. So we're talking about personal exposure to health hazards and measured and evaluated by a formally trained person. Obviously, the notes there talk about we don't want people taking assessments with smartphones or those sorts of things, even though there is some evidence to suggest that they are reasonably accurate. The OFSC wants this done from a reputable and defendable method on this, and that's the context of our interpretation at this point in time. The formally trained definition is an important part of it, and what we're looking for here is what part of the previous process says, well, we don't know enough about this, we need to actually get someone to come and take a measurement. Now, for formally trained to actually come and do personal exposure monitoring, we're looking for a person formally trained through a specific course related to that hazard, so they might have done a noise course or something like that. A professional hygienist will have experience in taking samples from all sorts of things, whether it's physical hazards around vibration, noise, or airborne contaminants around dust, diesel, and all those other things. So we want you to define that within your system. So we want you to define, not just say formally trained, but go, a formally trained person in the context of our organisation is someone who holds a minimum of X. And these are the sorts of things we're looking to get. We're also looking for, what that might be. Here's some examples of what sort of training might be formally trained under the definition. The BSB course around implementing WHS monitoring processes. The course content will often talk about auditing in that, but there is within the scope to do some learnings about particular contaminants, and there are existing courses that have that. There might be an internal training, particularly for a hygiene consultancy to a NATA approved method around a particular sample, and that would constitute formally trained. There are basic principles courses that are internationally recognised that are run by the Institute of Hygienists and others within the industry. If it's an asbestos-related thing, the formally trained person could be an licensed asbestos assessor, because there's a monitoring module within that qualification. And as I said again, if you're actually engaging a hygienist, there are some professional levels within that organisation. So what we're trying to do here is just give some examples of when you're trying to define formally trained, and 99.9% of companies in the scheme will engage a third party to do this, but we still need you to define what is formally trained within your system, and then you execute it in accordance with what your system said. And here's some examples of the sort of things you can put in your system, and then when you have this requirement triggered, you can go ahead and organise someone who meets that minimum qualification to do that sample. Now, the other part of the criteria is measured and evaluated by the formally trained person. So what does measured and evaluated mean? So what we're looking for here is that the sample that's taken is compared to the workplace exposure standards. And I've said it was so important I said exposure twice in my slide. Some health hazards, such as physical hazards, won't have a workplace exposure standard. Noise, and obviously noise has got an exposure standard around that, but within the workplace exposure standards, it's more around atmospheric and chemical contaminants. And then we're looking at the PCB duty on the right there, which is in the legislation, right? That a PCB must ensure that no person in the workplace is exposed to an airborne contaminant exceeding the workplace exposure standards. So within your system, measured and evaluated, we want you to talk about comparison to the workplace exposure standards and what we'll do if we have an exceedance against that particular exposure standard. It's important, though, also as a part of your evidence, and when you are engaging someone in this particular activity, that we're clear that dust sampling, for example, using static monitors is not compliant for personal exposure. So if we place some static monitors around a site, yes, that may give us an indicative measure of what dust is around the site, but it won't be a personal exposure measurement according to the Australian standard. But that can be used as can real-time monitoring and other devices for control validation to check that on our sites that we're controlling dust, for example, to an acceptable level. But when we're talking about the OFSC criteria here and measured and evaluated by a formally trained person, we're talking about personal exposure in this particular part of the criteria. Hopefully that makes sense. And then when does it need to be measured? So the OFSC, we're looking for within that 14.2 criteria context about what would happen in our system where we go, well, no, we don't need to get anyone to come in and measure anything. We're fine. So we've just got a process for 14.2, but we haven't triggered that because none of our risk assessments that we made in under criteria 14.1 required that. But we want you to have a prompt for that. And those sort of prompts might be that our residual risk level is above our tolerable risk levels. The controls that we've put in place, we don't think they're effective to reduce the risk of that particular hazard or the health hazard, or where we're just not sure, where the health hazard or the level of exposure is not properly understood. So we might get someone in to take a measurement on that. It's okay to have evidence from other projects where we've got that particular hazard and we can present that, and then that will inform our risk assessments for our future projects. But obviously within the system context and your criteria, we just want that prompt in the system to say, well, when do we need that? And has that been triggered? And this is a sort of what would a monitoring report from a hygienist look like? Would look like this. So we'd have the date, the sample, what task was being undertaken, and then some sort of coding or trigger where to say, well, was it above or below the exposure standard? And they're just some examples of that. You can see in the bottom table that there's been some measurements taken on noise that were considered to be above the exposure standard, and then we would, as an organisation, you would respond in that. So in the context of a federal safety officer coming to go to site, doing an audit, we're presented with this data. The auditor might ask the question, well, what did you do about those exceedances for noise? What did you put in place? And so there will be some evidence trail there to demonstrate that you might have put additional PPE in place, you might have removed that machine from site, or another exclusion zone based activity, depending on the generation of the noise and the source. Okay, so now we've got to 14.3. If you go back to my the 14.1, 14.2, 14.3 table of the workflow of the life cycle earlier, now we're into the area where we're talking about health surveillance and monitoring, as I discussed. Essentially, the crux of this criteria is we're really looking for the companies to have the way we describe we comply with our legislative requirements, because we're now in legislative requirement areas around, well, when is health monitoring triggered, and if we have to do it, what do we do? Now, we're not looking for anyone to cut and paste the regulations into their system, although a lot of companies do that. But what we want is the intent of the regulations to be put into the context of how the accredited company decides they will comply with that particular thing, and their own method of making sure that it happens. So again, we make a note here about pre-employment medical assessments. That's not what we're looking for in this particular matter. We're looking for when there is health monitoring required to be done, and when does it need to be done, and how would we do it? So just as a quick, what should the process in your system include? It should include a review of process for triggering health monitoring surveillance. So when does it need to be done? And obviously, when I said earlier around the any exposure to a substance in Schedule 14 and Schedule 9, plus asbestos and lead in all states and territories and others such as noise. These are all regulatory requirements that have been existing in legislation for a very long time. Obviously, triggers for that who can conduct that health monitoring or surveillance by an occupational physician or a medical practitioner, and noting that they need to be licensed in most, if not all, jurisdictions. And then particular parts of the regulation that talk about the management of results and records, about workers being provided copy, maintaining confidentiality. There's some things around work groups, how long we have to keep records for, so noting that it's 30 years and then 40 for asbestos in most jurisdictions. And then any notifiable requirements around exposures where someone's gone and had health monitoring and they have an occupational illness where we might need to notify the regulator. So keep note of that and include that in your system. Obviously, from an evidence perspective as an FSO, we're not looking to see evidence of actual medical results because of the confidentiality of that. But we may ask, depending on the context of what that health monitoring or surveillance that's been conducted, we may ask for evidence that it has occurred, so a verification from a particular PCBU or subcontractor that they've actually met their requirements for conducting that health monitoring or surveillance on their workers. This is just a screenshot of some of the, which everyone on the call will be aware of course, around what parts of the regulation talk about that duty for health monitoring, which these criteria are based upon. All right, so we're sort of out of the occupational hygiene specific parts of the WH14 criteria, and we're moving just now into the last two criteria. This particular one's about making sure that any measuring test equipment related to health and safety is identified, calibrated and maintained in accordance with OEM requirements and any legislative requirements. The note part here is that it's any measuring and test equipment related to health and safety. So we're not talking about electrical multimeters or survey equipment or those sorts of things. We're generally talking about common things like any occupational hygiene samples that are taken. So if we've used a sound level meter or dosimeter for noise, or if we've used a sampling pump or some other piece of device that requires calibration, that we have evidence that that occurred and it's within our system. One of the most common things we see at a site that's owned by accredited companies are breathalyzers and those sort of things, which we would expect those to be calibrated because we're taking a measurement related to a health and safety requirement around alcohol, drugs, or whatever it might be on that particular site in that project. So we would expect them to form part of their register and process, and the evidence of calibration available for inspection by the FSO. So that's just an example of of a calibration certificate that you might get for a sound level meter. And as I'd mentioned on the previous slide about its external occupational hygiene sampling. So we'll have it in our process that if we engage an external hygienist, we'll ask for those things. And we'll have a register, we'll have calibrations and next due dates, and obviously reference to any particular Australian standards or original equipment manufacturer requirements around those. So relatively straightforward, and it shouldn't regularly be triggered within your system. But obviously, like most things in FSC, just because we don't do it, we still, as a part of our accreditation requirements and meeting the criteria, we have a process within our system to manage this aspect should we need to. Finally, around WH14, around hazardous substances, this is relatively straightforward around code of practice and what everyone on the call no doubt will be doing for the management of hazardous chemicals on their projects. There's no real sleeping issues with this criteria, and it's not a highly corrective action criteria. I just made up a term there, but this isn't one that we regularly give corrective actions on. Not to the levels of the ones that Pauline mentioned earlier. But certainly we're looking for evidence of hazardous chemical registers. Obviously that's a duty in the regulations to have a hazardous chemical register on your projects. The provision and availability of SDSs and how we get those, what their currency is, they're Australian, those sorts of things. Any requirements for risk assessments within your system, such as a chemical-specific hazardous risk assessment, or some controls within the work method statement for that particular application of that chemical, which to me makes the most sense that we would do it task-based. And then normal things like labelling, storage and management of spills. I realise that's not an exhaustive list, but they're the sorts of prompts that we're looking for relative to management of hazardous chemicals. As an FSO, we're looking for a process that's dictated by the system, and then that you're meeting your system with those minimum regulatory requirements, and we'll do some sampling based on chemicals that are identified on site at the time of the audit and follow that through to all of the requirements within your system. Obviously, the compliance elements of this are pretty clear around the Compliance Code Victoria and the harmonised workplace management of hazardous chemicals in the workplace code of practice. That's sort of what we'll be working off, in addition to your system and the criteria, as I mentioned earlier, about the way that OFSC is audited. So hopefully that's pretty straightforward. That's close to the end of my presentation. In summary, I encourage you to refer to the audit criteria guidelines. And within the WH14 1, 14 2 criteria, be specific about those definitions of competent and formally trained, and note the difference between personal exposure monitoring and health surveillance or health monitoring in accordance with the regulations. Continue to focus on the identification of hazards and applying controls in the 14.1 criteria, where we're asking you to do that risk assessment. The most important thing you can do is to just identify the potential hazards and have controls in place for each of those. And that's what the FSO will essentially be evaluating at audit. Does your system have a process for capturing those, and are they consistent with the scope of works that we identified within the project and at the time of the audit? And then also as a base level, obvious element of following regulatory requirements and any company-specific specifications that you put within your system. Just because there's lots of things to look at, and some of these are technical guidance, but other elements around further reading and reference material. So the workplace exposure standards for airborne contaminants, that's current revision is January 2024. There's guidance on interpreting those. There's evidence if you have a relationship with the medical practitioner conducting your health monitoring, there's guidance for that. Obviously, the harmonised code of practice for management of chemicals. The AIOH, as I mentioned, is the professional body for hygienists. So if you are looking to put a hygienist reference in your system and looking to engage one, and then there's some guidance there around the professional levels and capabilities of various levels of membership within that organisation. It's not the only source, but it is a good, reliable source. And then obviously the OFSC audit guidelines that I mentioned earlier. All right, that's my presentation. I'll stop sharing and I'll hand over to Pauline for management of any questions that people might have.
Thank you, Brett. That was great. I appreciate you taking the time to present to us. Your insights were very valuable. And as we know, this is an area where we do see quite a bit of non-compliance. So it's great to get some more background and in-depth discussion on the criteria as well. I know I've learned something, and I'm hoping that everyone online has as well. We have had a couple of questions come through from the chat, which is great. Just want to kick off by asking you, firstly, what are a few practical methods or processes that accredited companies could implement to address the audit criteria WH14 and improve safety standards and outcomes for workers on site?
That's a nice broad question to start with. I like it. Look, my personal passion in the criteria really is about that 14.1 criteria, about making sure at the start of a project where we're really good at identifying physical hazards that will affect people's safety, but getting better at identifying health hazards. And that's why we've got the competent element in that. We're trying to make sure that the person doing the assessment respectfully has some understanding of what health hazards can be triggered by various activities on site. That's why we've got that element. So I would encourage, in the context of how do we get better about this, is about making sure that our risk assessment process includes a competent person, and we really go hard for identifying health hazards, and then we risk rate them to a point of making sure we've got controls in place, and then we manage it from that inspection and verification assurance process, making sure that the controls we've set are in place. We're also clear about when we're not sure and the risk level's too high, that we actually go and take a measurement if we need to. But I would discourage that unless you really had to, and just focus on the identification and controls of health hazards.
Great. Thank you, Brett. Another question we've had from one of our attendees here today. In terms of complex projects, what is considered a complex project, and is it determined by scale and costing or scope of works?
Yeah, look, that's a great question, and I think when I use the term complex projects, I guess I'm trying to get people to start at that project risk assessment end, like the answer to the last question. Complex projects will be ones where we've got large tunnelling projects, for example, or large-scale renewable projects where we've got a large project with a complex set of health hazards, whereby we're not sure that we would have adequate controls in place and understanding of the magnitude and quantum of the health hazards and what exposures they will have to our workers. And we want to understand, what could go wrong, what are the hazards that could affect people, and have we got enough things in place? So if we're not sure, we take a measurement and then we decide. So in the context of a complex project, I would say a quite large project over a long period of time with multiple different work groups doing different things, and an inadequate understanding of what health hazards could affect the workers. So we're talking mega projects, large projects.
Thanks, Brett. On a somewhat related issue, we've had another question come through asking or saying that sometimes it can be difficult to measure at the project crew site level due to the type of project, moving, location, environment. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, look, that's a really great question, and it's certainly something that a lot of companies in the scheme experience, where the actual task-based stuff, it's not only expensive to do that, but getting there at that particular point in time to take a measurement of that particular task that might only go for a short duration of half a day or less. So that's a great question. So I think without stepping outside my lane of this presentation, certainly regulators have got that in mind around particularly about codes of practice that have come out where they've said, well, these activities, you need to have these controls in place because we know that is a large activity that can affect workers or have an exceedance. If we don't need to do sampling, then I encourage us not to do it and just focus on the controls. And the OFSC does not define that you must take a measurement, but they want you to be very clear about when we think we would need to. If we do that activity on one project and we have some data from a project where we're doing the same activity, then obviously we can use that as an example. But that challenge around being able to take an occupational sample for a short-term activity by a PCBU that isn't ours, that's an industry-wide issue. OFSC isn't going to punish companies for not doing that, and we're certainly aware that that's difficult to do. So I would encourage people, again, just to focus on controls if you can.
Thanks, Brett. We've got a couple more questions coming through as well. One from a principal contractor. They ask, as a principal contractor, can we show evidence of monitoring from our contractors on site?
Yeah, absolutely. If the PCBUs or the contractors on site have had the fortitude to go and take their own measurements and sampling, of course you can. And again, following the audit process, we're there, audit the principal contractor. But if part of our, as long as we're not silent on that, so we would say, well, we in our model within our system is that the PCBU is responsible for measuring and managing the health of their own workers. And we've got that in our risk assessment process, and then the workers are able to present, or the PCBU, the contractor are able to present their own monitoring. Then that would be certainly acceptable and encouraged if they've gone and done that. So yeah, great if you can get that to happen.
Right. And from your experience being out on site, one of our attendees has asked, how have companies ensured calibrated equipment is compliant before it comes on site?
That's a really good question as well. So before it comes on site, it's a difficult one because you usually get the evidence of that equipment with your report, which could be 2 or 4 weeks later within the industry. So the evidence of calibrated equipment, there's usually a sticker on most equipment that will tell you when it's been last calibrated and when it's next due, like any test and tagged inspected piece of equipment, whether it's a soft sling or a chain block or whatever it might be. The same sort of evidence should exist with equipment on site. So a process for checking that could and probably should form part of your system. But obviously certificates, when you're engaging someone to do that activity, you can ask for them up front because they will exist. They don't go and collect them after they've taken that, or they've conducted that sampling. So to answer the question clearly, I would have a process or a trigger within my system to check for calibration prior to that and as part of the engagement. And certainly when the person coming to take the sample on site, that we check any evidence of calibration that they have at that point in time, if we can.
Thanks, Brett. Another question that's more Queensland specific. They're referring to the implementation of the Queensland Code of Practice on managing respirable crystalline silica dust exposure in the construction sector. Can you tell us how would we be best implementing controls to satisfy WH14.2?
Yeah, so to satisfy 14.2, I mean, obviously, you would going through the life cycle of the criteria. You would only be taking samples if your process dictated that. So I was going through what are the triggers from 14.1 when we've done our risk assessment that we would need to take a sample. I'm certainly conscious in Queensland with the specific example that the person asking the question has talked about. The code of practice here has some minimum standard controls in the appendix or the table that forms part of the code of practice where there's some minimum things that need to happen. So that would be my focus area. That would be where I start, where we focus on the controls that are defined by the regulator in that particular case, and whether that's vacuum, water sprays, respiratory protective equipment or ventilation or other on-tool extraction and all those things that are included in that code of practice would be where I'd start and make sure we focus on those areas as a primary element. Taking an occupational sample or a personal exposure sample, I should say, really just tells us the quantity of the issue, and it doesn't focus on controls. So I would encourage people to focus on controls that are consistent with the code of practice and any other things that we can do to reduce the level of exposure on site. If your budget was endless and your time was endless and you had people doing the same task for months and months and months on end, you could take a sample, put some controls in place and then resample to check that your controls were effective. And there are other ways of doing control verification on projects, but certainly I would encourage people just to focus on the controls that are regulatory required at this stage, particularly for RCS.
Thanks, Brett. Another question with respect to contractors. So in the case of the contractor on site, if they fail to present monitoring results on time or at all, what are the implications for a principal contractor from an OFSC perspective?
Well, that would be a unique set of circumstances where the auditor was on site at the time where we went through this particular criteria. It would require that the system or the principal contractor dictated that that needed to happen, again, because we're auditing the principal contractor, not the subcontractor. So there's no defined requirement unless your system says you need to, and your risk assessment dictates that we need to take a sample. But if it did, let's hypothesise that it did say that the PCBU or the contractor is going to do some personal exposure sampling, and that evidence wasn't available at the time of the audit. There are a number of ways that an FSO can tackle that. Again, it would be a unique set of circumstances. We could ask for evidence to be sent after, but that might not be within the reporting period. It might be that it just happened and there was evidence of someone coming on site to do that. It's not really within the scope of the FSO to say, well, they took a measurement and it was way over the exposure standard. What have you done about it? It was more about that we actually measured it. And then in the context of a control, obviously the controls are important, but I'm hypothesising here about how that would appear, where the auditor had got to site and that evidence wasn't available. But hopefully that sort of partially answers the question about, there would be no implications for the principal contractor unless there was something special within the system, or that particular hazard was still present on site and we hadn't done anything to understand the hazard or control the level of exposure. It'd be a unique set of circumstances, that's for sure.
Yes. Thanks, Brett. A question around similar exposure groups. Can you provide some commentary on that and how broadly they can be classified, practical considerations when considering similar exposure groups?
Yep. So again, I'm a federal safety officer auditor, not an occupational hygienist, but certainly that's a terminology used within the occupational hygiene profession, whereby they, instead of measuring every single person on site, they get people doing the same activities and they theoretically have a similar exposure. That's my very layman's terms verification of that, and hopefully there's no hygienists on the call who are going to and please feel free to correct me. So that's basically the way that a hygienist would take a large group of people and classify people doing similar tasks who will have a similar or comparable potential exposure on a particular project. So it might be on a tunnelling project, for example, it might be ring builders or tunnel boring machine operators or a civil particular contractor doing a task, or it might be plumbers on a site. So you would classify people doing particular tasks who will potentially have a similar level of exposure into a group called a similar exposure group. And if you were doing it on site and without calling it a fancy name like SEGs, you would just go, you could do plumbing activities, civil earthworks, etc., plasterers, partitions, etc. would be a similar exposure group in that context. It's more like you could do it like a trade if you wanted to on a less complex project.
Thanks, Brett. Look, I think that wraps up our Q&A session. Some really good questions coming through. It was very interesting to see the questions that attendees had here, and Brett's done a great job answering all of your questions. I'd like to once again acknowledge Brett for his great presentation and thank you for your time today. We hope it's been useful and interesting for our attendees here, and we will be holding more webinars as well in the future. All of us at the OFSC are really passionate about this work and contributing to upholding health and safety standards in the industry. We've also created a short survey which we'll post in the chat so we can get some feedback and make sure that we're meeting your needs with respect to our webinars. And also, if you have any suggestions for future webinars topics, we'd love to hear them. As mentioned at the start, this session has been recorded and we will be making it available online on our FSC website in the coming weeks for your viewing. You can also view our previous webinars on the FSC website. And finally, a reminder to follow the OFSC on LinkedIn. It's a great way to stay up to date with all our latest news, events and data. And thank you all again. Have a great day, and we'll see you at the next webinar. Thank you.